Hey friends, how's it going? It's Michael Parker back in December 2021. We are in the midst of Hanukkah, approaching Christmas. It is the holiday season, so none other better to have as a guest is our friend from the great North Star state of Minnesota. Martin Keller, how are you, brother?
Hey, Michael, I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm doing good, man. I've been reading your book, which you sent to me very kindly earlier in the year, and as a fellow rock and roll nerd junkie, man, it brings back a lot of fond memories. You and your fellow spudsman, Mr. Greg Helgeson, I want to say that correctly, Greg Helgeson, have put together this excellent book, Hijinx and Hearsay. It is a Scenester Stories from Minnesota's pop life. And I was around the rock scene and indie music scene in Texas about that same time. And just reading your book just made me think of so many good times. Tell me how you got into doing this, because I think we're roughly the same age. And I know you worked for a couple of papers, but give us a little bit of backup before we launch into the rest of this.
Well, the book really is I like to call it my fragmented memoir of those years covering pop culture. And I did that between the late 70s and the early 90s primarily, although I continued to freelance a lot of pieces through the 90s, and I still occasionally write something off and on right now. But Greg and I were hired by an alternative weekly monthly music rag, and I underscore the word rag. It was pretty funky.
I was hesitant to use that word the other day when we were talking back and forth because I didn't know if you would take umbrage to that.
No. The publication was called Sweet Potato, and there was a version of it that originated in Portland, Maine, and then moved to Boston. And eventually it became the weekly alternative newspaper City Pages, which unfortunately had its final demise in 2020 with the advent of COVID and the just generally the lack of revenues everywhere. And Greg and I were really the only bona fide staff. We even delivered the damn paper. We wrote it, produced it, and then had to drive in our lousy cars to drop it off at different locations until we, started to generate some revenue with it. It was published by a husband and wife team, and as your viewers probably know, Twin Cities was a pretty rich area for pop culture in that period.
I remember it well, and I was in Texas, and we had a little indie music scene, but you guys, my friends and I, we would look at Minneapolis. We're like, wow, I mean, so this guy Prince came out of Minneapolis, which surprised us. And then, kind of the people that we were looking up to and being influenced by at the time, the Replacements, Husker, Soul Asylum, those kind of bands were coming out. So it just seemed like this rich, really exciting place to be from.
Yeah, not only was the music scene blowing up and Prince and the Paisley Park Kingdom establishing itself internationally, but we had a really kick-ass comedy scene here that in parallel rose in prominence and produced comedians like Louis Anderson, Joel Hodgson, who created the Mystery Science Theater 3000, Movie Riffing, otherwise known as Movie Riffing, still going strong today. I think they're still out on tour recently. Liz Winstead, who went on to co-produce the Daily Show. So folks like that, and we had a lot of A-list comics like Jay Leno and Jerry Seinfeld coming through town at comedy clubs that seemed to be almost as prominent as indie rock clubs back then. So it was a pretty sweet period to be covering culture, and hopefully this book captures the spirit of that age.
Well, I'm going to jump ahead because since we're talking about scenes in general, one of the things I wanted to bring up to you is you think of music cities, there's LA, Nashville, New York, but to me, scenes are more interesting than long-standing kind of industry cities. Minneapolis, St. Paul had this creative music and comedic pop culture scene. I think of, in the 80s, I think of like Athens, Georgia. You know, in the late 80s, early 90s, there was, you know, the Seattle scene and Sub Pop. In Chicago in the 80s, we had like an industrial and house music kind of scene. And even in Dallas, Fort Worth, we had a little bit of a music scene. But what's interesting to me versus the cities on the coast and Nashville is like, this is a melding pot, not only of the artists of whatever genre or medium you're in, the journalism of the area, the clubs, the fans, and it's a whole thing that's much more real and special and rare.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I always like to think of the way these scenes arise and perpetuate themselves or not, really reflect something in rock and roll. You know, I'm fond of saying rock and roll capitals of America move locations on a fairly regular basis. And
True.
You know, during the 80s and the early 90s, I think, you know, the capital was here in the Twin Cities.
I would agree. I mean, in the 70s there for a bit, Detroit was happening. And Minneapolis, St. Paul, I had never visited the Twin Cities until, I guess it was the early 90s. I was working for the distribution arm of Rykodisc at the time. And I came to your fair city for one of our conventions, and I really enjoyed it. I never got to see First Avenue, or maybe we walked by and I wasn't aware of it. But that was my first experience with the city. I went there a couple more times, but it just, to me at the time when I was looking at it, I was like, wow, this is kind of an unlikely city in some ways for these things to come out of, but I guess not.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at somebody like Prince coming from a city like this, we had the second most conservative radio market in the country during that period. And more than once, Prince's early singles were not played here, except on a local community African American station called KMOJ. And the reason they often were not played here was because, quote unquote, program directors would say, it's too black. They actually said that of Funkytown, written by a nice white Jewish boy from St. Paul named Stephen Greenberg under the Lips Inc. moniker. They wouldn't play Funkytown because it sounded too black. So it was, you know, it's kind of a city of paradoxes and contradictions. We have a huge racial and economic achievement gap here between the white middle class and the African American communities, other people of color. And I think, you know, that was really came to light again, the chronic inequality that exists in the city when George Floyd was murdered by the police.
Yes.
I mean, that just opened up all the wounds. It exposed all the worms under the rocks. And, you know, it's a big problem for the city to address and resolve, if it is resolvable. Some days I'm cynical enough to think like, well, this is the way it's always going to be. But right. In spite of that, it produced some wonderful music, some great comedians, and a lot of good behind the scenes shakers and movers like Chuck Statler, who did the early Devo films, the godfather of the music, MTV music video. He's has lived here for a long time, since he moved here from Akron, Ohio, and it's got a rich cultural life in spite of all the social ills that it faces.
When you brought up Funkytown, I did not realize until I read your book that this gentleman who composed this stuff came from Minneapolis. I didn't know that. Yeah,
Greenberg. You know, I've always told him he needs to write a book just about Funkytown because it's been licensed in so many formats.
It's a cottage industry all its own.
Yeah, it definitely is. And he's never given me the figure of how much money it's generated in the last 30 years, but it's a lot of dough. I went on to do, work with Stephen on a bunch of other associated projects that he's pursued after Funkytown. But that damn thing, I mean, every year it's in a new commercial, and it's, it seems like it never goes out of style.
That's exactly right. You had a phrase that in the book, which I forgot. You said something to the effect that it was, I believe, kind of anachronistic yet continually popular or current at the same. It has a sound, it's some of it is anachronistic, but at the same time, it still sounds fresh. It's still fun. I don't know too many people that don't like that song. They may act like they don't like it, but they're tapping their foot.
Oh yeah, and kids like it, grandmas like it.
Yeah.
And when you look at the lyrics, it's really universal in that Funkytown is a place that everybody wants to go to, but it's a place that really doesn't exist. It's kind of this brass ring location that you're never really going to quite achieve.
I think you just gave me a good segue. These places that don't really exist that we want to go to. And I wore this shirt for a reason. George Harrison. I wanted to, speaking of places that we want to go or have been. I thought
that was a Material World t-shirt. Right on, bro.
Yeah. We're going to talk about Minneapolis and St. Paul, but I have to ask you this because I know, like me, you're just a total music nerd. So Get Back, my wife and I finished it up last night, and it's this epic, almost 9-hour, 3-episode thing about the Beatles and the rooftop concert and all the struggles that went up to that. I know you're a Beatles fan. We'll talk about McCartney and your interactions here in a minute, but just your thoughts on Get Back.
Well, I think you used the exact right word. It is epic. For me, the nuances in it and the little incidental music pieces, which there are many, really made it, I guess, a feast. It was an excellent Thanksgiving feast to have on Thanksgiving weekend. And I devoured it over Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Before I say any more about it, I think I have to pull a quote out by Mr. McCartney from the black and white film he did recently with the Guru. What's his name? Rick Rubin. I
haven't seen that yet. I heard about
it. That's worth checking out. But
okay.
there's a line that jumped out at me in there where they were isolating some of McCartney's brilliant bass tracks, and McCartney says, "Well, and this is a paraphrase. He says, Rick, if you control the bass, you can command the band." And I said, "All right." And I kind of went in to Get Back with that kind of in the back of my head. And you see McCartney throughout Get Back trying to produce the Beatles, which he actually says at one point. He says, I can't produce the Beatles. But in effect, he really is. He's pretty passive aggressive, I think. And you also notice that they really are rudderless without Brian Epstein.
Yes.
They need a manager in the worst way. And I think a lack of a manager, or at least a close personal aide, Mel Evans isn't going to cut it.
No.
He's a great aide de camp, but
he just worships them too much. I mean, he's like a sitcom character. I mean,
he's kind of a glorified roadie. He writes down lyrics that are being generated in the studio as they work, which was kind of mind blowing in and of itself. Yeah. But they're really lacking a father figure in this film. And they're like, they're a family, they're a band of brothers in the movie. And all of the chronic family dysfunctions are coming to the surface. All the yearning for maturity and freedom to do their own work is seeping through the cracks. And that's, obviously very much apparent with the George Harrison narrative in that film. I feel so bad for him. I mean, I knew from the first Let It Be film that George was kind of pissed upon in the movie and eventually walked out. But there's this heartbreaking scene where it's just him and Lennon and Yoko in the room, and George is saying, I'm thinking, like, I should do an album of Harrison songs. You know, you keep the Beatles thing over here. Maybe you guys play on the album. And Lennon kind of like, oh, you want to do that? Like, how the hell are you going to pull that off? I don't think so.
One of the things I was thinking about, you know, it's easy to make fun of Paul McCartney and people would, you know, savage on Paul McCartney. But honestly, when I watch that thing, he's a boss, man. He is taking the place of the father figure that you're pointing out. And, you know, maybe he's a little too pushy, but he's getting things done. And even this is here again, it's just maybe my impression of it, but their clothes that they wore, which George and Ringo had just awesome wardrobes. But Paul was dressing the part on a day-to-day basis in a way to me that made him look like the solid figure, because he would wear these, you know, George was very extravagant. John was wearing this white stuff. His hair was rarely washed. But Ringo was also dressing flamboyant, but Paul almost looked like a businessman of the band. And when people would come in and talk to the band, oftentimes they would defer to Paul as if he were the boss. And I don't know, it kind of gave me in some way a bit of a deeper appreciation, because it's everybody hates the boss. Everybody always hates the boss. And he was perhaps a bit passive aggressive, but Lennon was in a pretty good mood. And this coming from a guy who was obsessed with Lennon at one point, he was kind of he was playing and he was having a good time, but I don't feel like he was pushing the boat that much or pushing.
Yeah, you know, Lennon's creative output in that period was pretty low compared to his past endeavors. And I think, and I could be wrong about this, and I hope I don't get sued for saying it, I think he was using heroin at that point.
Could be.
Because if all the reading I've done on that period serves me well or doesn't, I'm pretty sure John was using. I mean, he was always late for arrival times and sometimes 2 hours late. But yeah, McCartney kind of takes over. But it's funny because he says at one point, you know, like, well, you know, the Beatles, and they refer to it almost as an entity beyond themselves, and really that's what their brand kind of became. I mean, there was a Beatles brand, there was a Beatles sound, and I think they're all invested in protecting that, but the urges to just do their own material, and in George's case, to have more of a participatory voice in what songs get used and which ones don't, especially his, that gets lost in the Lennon-McCartney lordship, if you will, in that authority.
I would agree with that. One other thing before we move back to Minneapolis that I wanted to ask you about, because this is just here again, this is just my feeling while watching this. First of all, I really enjoyed it. I loved the way it looked, and it was very refreshing. And I noticed that, you know, everybody's talking about it on social media. And what I wanted to express to you is, like, isn't it interesting that here at the end of 2021, with all the crap that we have been through for the last 3 years, you know, literally for the 21st century has kind of sucked, in my opinion, and we bring these four young lads from Liverpool back on television. And at least for me, there was, you know, they were fighting as families do, but there's just this optimism and there's this enthusiasm and there's creativity, and it was such a step away from USA circa 2021 for me. And I wonder what you think about that in a good way.
Yeah, I don't think it's nostalgia. I think that film captures many times the sheer joy of making music, number one.
Yes.
It also kind of lays bare the spontaneity of the creative process, at least with their songwriting experiences. And, you know, I've seen a lot of posts by songwriters on social media going, oh my God, You mean the Beatles actually created music like they did in the studio, you know, with not very many ideas, and they worked out lyrics and they worked out riffs as they went along? That's how I work. That's how I work. I kept seeing that over and over again. And it was kind of surprising, although I said to my oldest daughter, who's obviously now a big Beatles fan, I said, you know, I don't know if writing songs in the studio is the best use of time.
Right.
I said, I mean, these guys had enough money where they could do it at that point, but I think there's a funny line from either Alan Parsons or Glenn Johns who goes, well, you know, boys, it's 2 shillings a foot of tape for everything we put down here, because you know how many times did we hear,
Yeah.
you know, different incarnations of Get Back. And I don't think anyone's ever going to forget the riffs or the lyrics to Don't Let Me Down. I mean, there must have been 20 versions of that heard in that over 3 days.
Yeah. It definitely reduced some of the mythology regarding them and humanized them even more and made them a little bit more like regular people. Because when you were watching them, hey, not everything sounded great. Not every day they sounded great. And I mean, they usually sounded pretty good, but they were having fun. They're goofing around and they're working and they're creating. And for me, it was just, plus they're incredibly charismatic watching these 4 people. I told my wife the whole show was almost like a sitcom, because you mentioned Mal Waldron. I mean, to me, that guy who clearly loved the Beatles, he almost just looked like a character out of television, because he had the smile and the haircut, you know. And then Glenn Johns, who I didn't really know was that big a part of that album. And, you know, he's wearing the rock and roll clothes, even though he's kind of producing. But it was just a thoroughly enjoyable experience. And yeah, nostalgia is not the right word. I guess to me, it was just fresh and uplifting for a moment.
Well, there's a lot of joy in Beatles music, and I think that joy kind of rises like a field of rose scents through the TV screens, through your download, however you watched it. I just think there's so much joy in their music, even in some of the more down tempo ballads and stuff. It sounds good, it feels good, the lyrics are meaningful, the riffs are unmistakable, the hooks. I don't think nostalgia is the right word to throw over this.
Right. Well, let's jump forward to, I guess it's 1989 or 1990. You get a chance to look the man in the eye, Mr. Sir Paul McCartney, by this point, I think, and you got to pose a couple of questions to him. Not many people have got to do that I know of.
I got very lucky. That was McCartney and Wings were playing. I don't think they were Wings at that point.
I think in the book you said this is post Wings.
Yeah, I think you said right after they dropped Wings, and it was just Paul McCartney. And they were playing at Ames, Iowa at the university, because the university was going to endow a chair in his name for environmental studies. And they also had, I think, a good organic, like home economics field of study there. Anyway, so McCartney said he'd come there and play, and he, take the fellowship or whatever it is. And so we went down to cover it for the Twin Cities Reader, another alternative weekly. And my photographer, Greg Helgeson, who has over 150 beautiful black and white photos in this book, was kind of hanging around listening to McCartney and the band just jamming during sound check, playing a bunch of old rock and roll covers like you actually hear and Get Back as well. And then when they were over, he was in the right place at the right time. And here they come, Linda Paul and the keyboard player. I'm blanking on his name. And McCartney, he's probably been the most photographed man in the world. He mugged for Greg's camera, and that photo made it into the book. But I somehow ended up in the front row for the press conference. I don't know why. There was no pushing or shoving. I just got in the door early, and the front row was open. So I sat down and I got to ask the first question. And
tell us what that first question was.
I can't even remember now.
Well, I know you said they caught you off guard because you didn't expect to get
I didn't
so
have
quickly.
any questions created because I didn't think I'd have a chance to ask any. So I think I asked him something like, well, you've been to the States a few times now. How do you find America? How do what's the vibe you're getting? And he kind of gave me a softball answer to a softball question. And then, excuse me, 15 minutes later, he looked over in my direction. And I thought he was looking for another question. So I asked him another question. I asked him about hip hop, if he listened to any hip hop, and his eyebrow went up and he looked at me and he kind of scolded me. He goes, "You've had your turn.
Let me ask
Give
you
others
this.
a chance."
Do you think that he did just want to give others a chance, or he didn't want to answer that question? What do you think?
No, I think he's pretty democratic. And there were a lot of media people in the room. So, and we only had about 20 minutes.
So he wasn't dodging. He was just trying to.
Yeah, I think he was being equitable. But at the end of it, I had brought along my spare copy of Prince's Black Album to give to him. And I held it up and I tried to, flag him, but he was being escorted off. But then one of his aides came over and I said, "Give this to Paul. It's Prince's Black Album. He might be interested in it because I think Prince is going to pull it from distribution." So I don't know. I put my address inside it. I thought maybe I'll get a thank you note from his office, but I'm still waiting for that, Mr. McCartney.
Remind me. So, I had a copy of the Black Album for a moment, but I thought I had a bootleg or something. Did it actually hit the shelves for a minute? I don't remember.
I don't think it did.
Right.
I somehow ended up with two. I think I got one from the Prince camp from his management, and I think I got one from the local Warner Brothers rep. And then it didn't go anywhere. He had second thoughts on it and pulled it, but you can hear it all over YouTube these days.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about another icon and another favorite son of Minnesota, and that would be Mr. Bob Dylan, Mr. Zimmerman. When I spoke to you last, you said that you were considering writing a book on him. Is that happening?
I think it will. I think it's my winter project. I've been putting pieces together mentally. I've made quite a few notes, and I'm going to line up some interviews with some folks that probably aren't relevant yet to your audience. But I'm pretty sure I'm going to go forward with it. I think I have enough to turn out a pretty interesting book. I had a lot of quality time with Dylan in the early '80s around the release of Infidels in '83, and then in '94 I spent a week on the Never Ending Tour through a leg of the Midwest, different cities: La Crosse, Wisconsin, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, Fargo, North Dakota, Bismarck, North Dakota. And that was an interesting trip on a number of levels. But I had seen Dylan quite a bit running around town in the summer of '83. And he would bring his kids with him to concerts. Like I remember I saw them backstage at the Clash. He knew who I was at that point. He kind of gave me like a sour look, like, "Are you following me around?" Because Bob's very wary of being used, and I don't think he likes media. I don't think,
right.
Number one, I don't think he's really understood how it works. But we had a mutual friend and a guy named Larry Keegan, who was one of Bob's friends from when they were teenagers. They met at a Jewish summer camp at Camp Herzl, and Larry had a diving accident when he was 16 in Florida that rendered him paraplegic. Bob never really abandoned him. He remained friends with Larry through thick and thin, and until Larry died in 2001 of a heart attack. But Larry subsequently became quadriplegic when he rolled his hand-controlled Cadillac in Mexico. It's a pretty interesting story. I actually helped Larry with his autobiography, which still never been published, but And then we did a film script based on his life that was almost produced. That's still on the shelf too. But if you see the last Scorsese film with Dylan, the Rolling Thunder film, there's a
which I haven't watched yet, but
yeah, well, it's pretty good, although there's a lot of funny stuff going on. There's a wonderful 20-second scene where Bob's in the back of a van with a guy, and you can't tell he's paralyzed, but it's Larry. He's covered in an Indian blanket, and they're singing an old Hank Williams song together. We were pretty delighted to see that, because that's obviously a frame in the film Bob didn't have to put in there, but I think he did out of respect to Larry. But I've been a Bob Dylan fan since I was in high school, and I can't tell you how many Bob Dylan dreams I've had in my life. I had one 3 or 4 months ago, and then to actually get to meet him and I had a 4-hour interview session with him, and that interview was circulated around the world.
Was that the 83 Infidels interview?
Yeah. 83, with the release of the Infidels album. And that entire interview has never been published entirely on its own. So that would be another, I guess, perk for the book.
Yes.
Have the whole thing there. So long answer. Yeah, I think there's going to be a Bob Dylan book for Martin Keller one of these days.
Well, there should be. You're a fan and you had access to him. Not very many people have, and he's a very guarded man. I mean, when you say 4 hours, I mean, that's surprising to me. That's very generous.
Well, there was a lot of small talk in that 4 hours, and I didn't have a lot of time to prepare. Larry called me up. He said, "Hey, Bob wants to do an interview. Can you come over?" And around 9 o'clock or so, and I went, "Oh, geez, this is about 4:30 in the afternoon."
Where did the article initially run? Which paper?
Initially ran in City Pages, and then it ran in Us magazine. It was syndicated around the world through a newspaper syndicator in New York. Showed up quite a few places, and I think New Musical Express picked it up. So it got good play. Here's some really good quotes in it. The funny thing about it is that Bob made some last minute copy edits to it when the thing was pasted up on the page. He phoned him in, and he sent one of Larry's friends down to the production office because I was out of town, and he dictated some changes to the interview, which actually made it better. And it was him talking about what his so-called religious / spiritual beliefs were, which going into the interview was territory that you were not supposed to go into. Larry said, "You can ask him anything, but don't talk about the alleged Christian conversion. That's off limits." But I think the first question I asked him before I even turned the tape recorder on was like, "I know you don't want to talk about this, but I think it would be interesting to people to know where you're at." And he got kind of pissed off, and he goes, "People want to know where I'm at because they don't know where they're at." a perfect Dylan one-liner.
Absolutely. Well, you also, one thing that made me laugh when I was reading, you said that it might be the same encounter when you guys were backstage at the Clash show. I don't remember, but you said that Jacob Dylan, his son, was displaying to you his nunchuck skills at the time.
Yeah, that was an incident that summer. It wasn't at the Clash show. It was at a party for Elvis Costello and his band. That Chuck Statler's film crew had a party for those guys because they had shot the early Elvis videos, and they wanted to, all hook up. And then I mentioned it to Dylan's friend that there's this party. If he wants to come, he can come, bring whoever he wants. I never expected him to show up. I look out the window, he's pulling up in his Cadillac, and 3 of his kids get out with him, and they spend a pretty good chunk of time at that party. And Jacob had these nunchucks, I mean, he couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old at that point, and he was showing me how they work. He was actually pretty handy with them, and it's not a kid you want to cross.
Right. Well, another giant that you rub shoulders with, I mean, here again, this is something that I don't know if I know anybody besides you who's done it. You got high with Bob Marley.
Yeah, we got very high with Bob.
Let's talk about that.
Well, one of the things I think that makes this book interesting is we were in a period then where access to artists was almost unlimited, very little control. It just didn't exist, and it went away in the late 80s, like probably 1988, things started to get really buttoned up. PR people controlled just about everything. Access, Greg and I had tremendous access to artists like Marley. We spent time backstage during their sound check, at which a very interesting, I think it was a mystical moment, occurred while the band was jamming. And then the next day in his hotel suite in downtown St. Paul, we had 3 hours with him in the suite, which is pretty unheard of. Anyway, the interview went sideways pretty quickly when Bob started to talk with us. And, maybe 10 minutes into it, he whips out a spleef about that long. I mean, it was the size of a small banana, and it went around the room several times. And it clouded a lot of our perceptions.
Well, you mentioned something that he said, and I'm not sure I've heard this. I risk appearing incredibly unhip, but you guys started talking about some metaphysical things, and he speaks on the end times a little bit, but the Black Bible, you said, what is that? I'm not hip to that.
I don't know. You know what? I'm still trying to figure out if this is a real thing, or if it's just a way that some members in the African American community or the Rastafarian community reads the Bible. They read it at a different level through a different lens. And the way Marley explained it, or tried to explain it, it's the 12 apostles of Jesus are aligned with the 12 horoscope symbols.
Yes.
And that's how you read it. Like if you're, I'm a Capricorn, so apparently Joseph, who gets sold into Egyptian slavery in the Old Testament story, he would be my link to the Bible based on my. I mean, it's pretty obscure and dense, and I need to talk to somebody like Cornel West or somebody who goes, is there such a thing as the Black Bible, or is this just some sort of trope that exists in your community that I'm not hip to?
Well, I'm super intrigued. When I read that, I was like, wow, that hanging out with Marley, and then he goes off on a nice ramble on the metaphysical. That's beautiful. Some of my favorite bands to this day are in your book, and one of them is the Rolling Stones. And at one point, you need to go see the Rolling Stones, which we all do. And how did you make money to get that ticket for that Stone show?
Well, before I answer that, the Stones were just in town here playing the big football stadium. I didn't go. I just stopped.
I did. I went to go see him again at SoFi. This is like my 5th or 6th time to see him.
Yeah, I've seen him 4 or 5 times. Yeah. But the first time I ever saw the Stones was in Minneapolis, St. Paul. I had just moved here. I had no money, and I'd never seen the Stones. I lived on the East Coast when the 72 tour with Stevie Wonder, that would have been a great show to see.
Oh, yeah.
When they were playing at, a couple different stadiums around the region there, but I never went. So I relocate here to the Twin Cities, and the Stones are coming to town. I'm going, well, I'm going to go find $35 somehow. And somebody said, hey, if you sell blood plasma, they'll give you $35. I said, I'm there. So I sat in a chair for 2 hours and gave plasma. I think the first and last time I've ever done that. I've given blood, but I've never given plasma before. So I literally gave blood to see the Stones.
As you do. I mean, the blood money for real. You said that Peter Tosh was going to play the Caboose, which is a famous club in Minneapolis at the time. Tell us about that.
Well, on that tour, the Stones have been showing it up at clubs under, fake names. I forget. They had a funny name for one of the gigs they played, and there was if you looked at their touring calendar, you could see they were in Chicago, and then they had the next day off, and then the next day they were in St. Paul. So speculate, and Peter Tosh was opening for them, and Peter Tosh had a gig at the Caboose on the day off, and everybody that was paying attention went, "Hey, this is the place to go. If they're going to show up, they're going to show up for this gig." Sure enough, they did. I was in the bar, and I could see Mick and Keith come out through the back curtain on the stage, and they kind of sat down behind the drums and were talking to each other. And then a friend of mine came in and said, "Charlie Watts is in the back of the room with his wife." And then somehow word got to the local ABC affiliate, TV affiliate here, and that the Stones were going to play at the Caboose. And they sent a reporter down here, and they broke in to their programming and announced it. And literally within 10 minutes, there were a couple thousand people, and they were on the roof of the club. The management locked the doors because they thought there was going to be a freaking riot, and the Stones vanished. I mean,
yeah,
it was a real spoiler, but Peter Tosh was good.
Well, that was the Bush Doctor period, I think. I remember seeing on Saturday Night Live, was the name of the song "Walk and Don't Look Back"?
Yep, that's it.
Yeah, and because Jagger joins him on stage, and that was the first time, like I say, I was in the middle of nowhere in West Texas. That was the first time I really saw reggae, or my initial taste of it. And so I definitely remember that period. Well, let's move on. Let's actually talk more about Minneapolis now. And in the 80s, I remember, man, people were so psyched about the Replacements. I got to be honest, don't hate me. I didn't really get into the Replacements that much. But like Husker Du, we loved. And Soul Asylum, we were really into. I have some friends in Texas still who really dig Soul Asylum. But just tell me about that whole time period that those bands were coming up. Because when I said earlier that I couldn't really picture Prince coming from Minneapolis, I could definitely picture these kinds of bands coming from Minneapolis.
Yeah, that whole indie rock thing with the Mats and Soul Asylum and the Huskers, I still don't really know how it got started, other than that was the period where the indie rock spirit was alive and well. Yes. And the kind of turning away from overproduced industry rock, the Fleetwood Macs, who were some other big sellers back then.
Well, just all the arena rock 70s. It was, and we'd gone through post-punk, and this was kind of America's, I also remember like in Southern California, because I wrote this down, I was going to mention when I was thinking of scenes. So there's Minneapolis, mid-80s. Southern California had some punk. SST was out here.
Yep.
Black Flag, stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, Minneapolis, that scene was one of the first kind of more, I don't want to say commercial, but like, I think they were more commercial in a good way than the SST bands, if that makes any sense. Or more accessible. That's the word I'm looking for. More accessible.
Yeah. Well, the Replacements established a reputation pretty quickly for either being very brilliant or very messed up on stage, usually drunk.
Yeah.
And that was part of the fun in going to see them. Well, are they going to...
Which band shows up?
Are they going to put on a show, or are they going to show us that they don't really care but what we think? And it's funny because, Minneapolis is really a big small town when you get down to it.
I can see that.
Paul Westerberg's son ended up going to the same grade school that one of my kids went to. So I saw him quite a bit. I'd already met him several times and done some interviews with him, but I used to start seeing him at school functions and kid basketball games. And so I got to know him a little bit. I remember going over to his house one time to pick up a hat or something, that a stocking cap or mittens or something that my kid had left over there on a play date. And Paul says, "Oh, it's downstairs, come down here." And that's where Paul's studio was after he left the band. And I get down there, I see all these really nice, really good records out of their sleeves, just kind of spread out across this table. It's like, oh, those are in good shape.
Yeah.
And he had just finished reading Dylan's Chronicles, and he said, "Have you read it?" I said, "No, I haven't read it yet." And he got so excited. He goes, "Oh, Marty, man, you have got to read this book. It makes me want to write a book." And I said, "Well, you should." And he gave me a funny look. But the Mats, they're probably more popular now than they ever were when they were together. They probably
Agreed.
sell more records now.
Agreed.
And apparently the new box set of Sorry Ma Forgot to Take Out the Trash is a killer package for Replacements fans, and a good introduction to the band that if people don't know them. Same thing with the Huskers. I always thought when I saw them early on that they, like at the 7th Street entry, which is the adjacent club to First Avenue, where lots of bands cut their teeth. I always thought those guys were learning to play on stage.
Yeah.
And that was confirmed in this wonderful film that if you haven't seen it, you should check it out. It's called Let's Make a Scene. It's about the Longhorn Bar, Minneapolis' first punk/new wave bar where lots of bands played. B-52s, Talking Heads. David Johansen did a set in there one night.
It's called Let's Make a Scene.
Let's Make a Scene. It's
I'm looking this up.
Mark Ingebrigtsen. There's a lot of interviews with bands that played at the Longhorn, but somebody in the film goes, "Oh yeah, the Huskers could hardly play," and they looked at stage time as practice time.
Well, Martin, I absolutely believe that, and I think that's one of the cool things about indie rock and punk rock, and certainly in my life, that was the way it was. It's like, yeah, a lot of people learned how to play actually being in bands. And some people might argue, well, you guys never got it right. But I could totally see, and listen, I don't revisit the Husker Du records that often anymore, but at the time I really dug it. And you could just listen to the records and hear that they're getting better at their instruments. Then in the 90s, when I moved out here, I eventually, as I mentioned before, I took a job with Rykodisc, and Bob Mould was signed to Rykodisc, doing all the Sugar records. And so I got to see him play quite a few times. And I'm a fan. I loved hard rock and I loved good melodies, and he gave you both of those things. And there was also an inherent sadness in Bob's music, I think, that I could relate to. But yeah, Husker Du definitely got better over the years that they were together, and Bob has continued to, he's still putting out records. It's unbelievable.
He's made a really good career out of where he came from. The trio was kind of doomed from the beginning. The personnel, the Grant, Hart, Bob Mould,
Grant passed away like just a couple of years ago.
Yeah, a while ago now.
Okay.
But they clashed on a regular basis over a lot of different things. There was pretty heavy drug use, which didn't help matters.
Right.
But there's a funny story in the book about the book. Really, for those who don't know, Hijinx and Hearsay really is a collection of backstories that touches on stuff. It's not a rehash of stuff I had written, except for the Devo interview that I had to reprint that because the things that Jerry Casale said then are even more true now, unfortunately.
Yes. Yeah.
Anyway, these are it's a collection of 42, 43 vignettes or backstories about, well, what happened when you went on the road with Bob Dylan, or what was Bob Marley really like once you sat down with him, and blah, blah, blah. But there's a funny anecdote in the Husker chapter, which is accompanied by about 5 or 6 great Greg Helgeson photos.
Which we're going to run. We're going to run a bunch of the photos that you've given me within this interview.
The Zen Arcade Album came out, which may be kind of the apex of the Husker output, at least in my opinion. That was a double album. It came out. I didn't spend hardly enough time with it, and I tossed off a review. And in the review, I said that it was transitional at best. Now here's an album that what's his name in Rolling Stone? Who's
David Frick?
David Frick, whose work I have always admired. He called it the equivalent of the Who's Tommy, and I'm going, oh my God, how could I have missed this? How could I have messed this up so perfectly in print? Well, anyway, I'm headed to my local record store, Orpho Jokopus, which was kind of a scene unto itself. A lot of rock guys would hang out there. Peter Jesperson from Twin Tone, who signed the Replacements and the Jayhawks and Soul Asylum, all those guys could be seen in this record store. I went in there for something. Bob Mould was coming out the door with a stack of letterhead size paper in one hand and Scotch tape in the other.
He's flying the town.
I noticed on the door he's taped it up, and it's the line from my review, transitional at best, Martin Keller, Twin Cities Reader. And I'm going, uh-oh. I don't know if Bob thought he was, taking some kind of revenge, or he actually liked the line. I mean, I still don't know, but it made me go back and re-listen to that record about 10 more times.
It could have been a little bit of both, because when someone says something about you and you're a band, it's like, sometimes even if you don't like it, it's like, if it's controversial enough, like, yeah, there's no bad publicity. Maybe he liked it. I don't know,
but he was a man on a mission, because he was going to go around and tape that up on different, light poles and other record stores, I'm sure. So,
well, before we move on to Prince, when you say that, you were kind of moving on from writing, I mean, and you and I talked about this yesterday a little bit, we do have to say something just about the nature of alternative press coming up in the 70s and the 80s into the early 90s. I mean, especially the 80s and early 90s, there for a while, man, that was one of the most exciting things. There were so many fanzines. There was weekly newspapers. There's these rags. There was just, and even more mainstream, there's Cream and Hit Parader and Circus that you could buy in the grocery store if you, like me, in the middle of nowhere. So, part of the reason that you left doing this was the pond began to dry up for advertising, and unfortunately these kind of papers were going away.
Yeah, the pond was drying up. I had covered the scene for since 78 to 88. I had a really great 10-year run. Probably one of the few people in North America anyway that had as much quality time with Prince and Bob Dylan as anyone around. I mean, I was in the right place at the right time, thank God. But I was burning out on the scene.
Sure.
Shortly after I left journalism, the business model started changing. The internet, this thing called the internet, arrived in 89, 90, and it blew everything up. So that the 80s really, that's one of the reasons when Greg and I set out to do this book in 2019, we took a look back and we said, this was really the last era for a lot of things, including the alternative weekly press that had its roots in the alternative press of the 50s.
Mm-hmm.
And that was starting to disappear because companies were buying up weekly papers like the Village Voice,
Yeah.
which at that point was kind of the beacon of alternative weeklies. It produced so many great writers. And they just diluted the hell out of it. And the Voice eventually went out of business. The group that bought the Voice eventually bought City Pages, and then they bought the Twin Cities Reader simultaneously. And the next day after the sale closed, they shut the Reader down, and 30 people were out on the street. Greg Helgeson had a whole file cabinet of photos that nobody knows what happened to those. That's how quickly they turned the lights out on that place. Really pretty tragic on a number of levels. So, and the state of the alternative press now is pretty abysmal. I mean, it's everything online, and
Right.
City Pages itself folded about 18 months ago. And when that happened, man, I felt, even though I haven't been involved in it in 20, 25 years, a little piece of me died when they shut that thing down.
I get it, because there for a while, I know, sorry, I'm going to turn this off. In Minneapolis, I think you mentioned that your paper came out on a Wednesday. Well, in the towns that I've been in, our papers of the same type would come out on a Thursday. But anyway, that was my favorite day of the week, because the paper was coming out. I get to see all the bands that are going to be in town. Maybe the name of your band is in the listings, but it's just everything that my life revolved around at that time was in that Thursday paper, whether it was the Dallas Observer in Texas, or whether it was the LA Weekly here in LA, or the Reader for you in Minneapolis. And I mean, it was really a grand time and so much fun. And the paper was a big part of that.
Yeah, that was really a great period for alternative press. And
well, I miss it, but so it goes. So let's end up on you can't talk about Minneapolis without talking about Prince. And I know that people always ask you about Prince, and I'm going to do the same thing. So, but we have to talk about Prince because, as you said, you actually had time with the man. And here again, like Dylan, this is a very guarded man. How did you first meet Prince?
I first met Prince when his debut album was coming out. I think he was 17 or 18. He was over at his drummer's house, Bobby Z, and he was sitting on the kitchen floor, and his hair was in cornrows. So I went over and I sat down with him, leaned against the refrigerator. He was against the stove. I mean, it was a pretty small space. And I got very, very brief sort of yes and no answers from him. He was really extremely shy. At first, I thought it was an act. I thought he's just copying an attitude here. But Prince was genuinely very introverted and obviously had no media skills at that point. Had just started talking to the press. And I am thinking in the back of my head, man, I don't know if I'm going to get enough quotes for a story, but it turned out all right. And then I continued to cover him on a regular basis. I had a column, in addition to being the music editor at City Pages, I had in writing feature stories. I also had a gossip column called Martian's Chronicles by Martian Keller. It was the play on my full name, Martin Keller.
Nicely done.
Yeah, it was fun. It was a fun column. It's the only thing I actually miss writing, even after 30 some years. But in the column, I at one point called Prince his royal badness, and that became a thing. I heard Mark Goodman at the premiere for Purple Rain in Los Angeles yell it out over live MTV television. Here he is, his royal badness. And I was out there for the premiere covering it. And I went, hey, that's my line. I've arrived.
When I read, I think it's on one of these gentlemen on the back of your book may mention it or something. But when I read that you're the guy who came up with that, I was like, I'm impressed, because I liked Prince. And when I would read that there, His Royal Badness. I'm like, that is a kick-ass nickname moniker. So well done.
Yeah, thank you. It's just one of those things. You're at the keyboard and you write it and you go, oh yeah, oh, that sounds pretty good,
and it's fitting,
and it fits. Yeah, it fits really good. But I did a lot. I did a lot of Prince stories. His output was unbelievable. Like I said, I went to the Purple Rain premiere in LA, and then in the early 90s with the Emancipation album, after he had left Warner Brothers after that horrible split, and he was, he had Slave written on his cheek and stuff like that. I had some quality time with him and his wife at the time, Mayte, out at Paisley Park, and I did a cover story for one of the city monthly magazines here, and it's probably the best thing I think I've written about Prince. There's excerpts from it in Hijinx and Hearsay, but he was very friendly. Obviously, he's an international superstar by this point. He seemed very happily married. We talked about John Lennon becoming domesticated after he and Yoko finally married and started a life. And I don't know what else I can say about it. I mean, I went to some of his birthday parties at the Prom Center, which is an old ballroom that's now torn down. I had a lot of quality time there. I think he liked what I did, and I was never asked to leave anything. I even walked into they had a casting call for extras, and I went out to it. It was at some hotel near the airport. Prince was in a room with the filmmakers and his new management from Los Angeles, and I had bought this purple electric rose at a James Brown concert a week earlier as kind of a gag gift, and I gave it to him. I said, "This is for you." I mean, I just walked into the room, and he rolled those big brown eyes like, "You got to be kidding me." And I said, "It's a joke. It's a joke. I got it at the James Brown show." I
always wondered whatever happened to Des Dickerson. You remember the guitar player that he had?
Yeah. Des eventually went to Nashville, and I communicated with him off and on. I think the last time was over a LinkedIn message, and he was going to do a Prince film, and then Netflix came in and said, "No, we're doing a Prince film." So
of course
everybody went away, including Des. But I think Des worked in the business for a while. Maybe he may have been involved in Christian rock music at some point.
Interesting.
Yeah, that first Prince band was pretty badass.
Yeah, they were.
I mean, they had a lot of attitude. They looked great. Andre Simone.
Yes.
Bobby Z on drums.
And you talk about the time and Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, and I had forgotten that they were part of the time initially, and I didn't know that Prince kicked them out.
Yeah, they had flown to Atlanta to work on an SOS single, which ended up being a hit, and they got stuck down there because of a blizzard, and they missed a rehearsal. No, they may have missed a gig. They either missed a gig or a rehearsal. Prince did not tolerate any shit like that.
Right.
And they were done. It's probably the best thing that happened to them, because they've been one of the most successful songwriting producing teams in the history of the music. So
he will, Prince reminds me a little bit of Frank Zappa, because they're both intense task makers. Their work ethic was superb, and kind of you're wired, you're fired kind of guys, and you better be here on time and you better play your parts. And they were just iconoclastic, no bullshit.
Prince
musicians.
Obviously was a workaholic, and I think when he became addicted to pain pills, the combination of the two was fatal. Pretty sure the day he died, he had been in the recording studio. In fact, he was coming up from the studio on that famous elevator.
Yeah.
and passed away right outside the door of it. But yeah, very sad day, that day in April.
Yes.
Still get choked up about it.
So I don't want to end on that. What I would like to end on, what is going on in Minneapolis, St. Paul now? I mean, clearly we had this George Floyd tragedy and the city's working itself back together, but what all's going on in Minneapolis, St. Paul? Is there good things? Is there good music and art still happening?
There's still a really viable scene here. There's lots of singer-songwriters like Jeremy Messersmith. The Jayhawks are still at it. There's a radio station here run by Minnesota Public Radio called The Current, which has been a godsend for local musicians and musicians from around the Western world who could not get airplay on any radio stations unless a college station. They've done a really good job of curating and cultivating the local scene here. There's bands now that clubs have opened again. There's bands playing all the time.
Excellent.
It's still a viable scene, but all the business models that existed when I was covering the scene, they've all changed. And
yeah,
but I think people respect the history that the cities have produced, and I hopefully have captured some of that in the book, as well as telling some fun backstories.